Okay, this is when we have to talk about narrative framing when it comes to certain characters versus other characters. So believe it or not, I'm not actually a Nesta apologist. I'm more of an Elaine apologist than anything else. But I think there's such a vocal pro-Nesta community in the ACOTAR fandom because the narrative doesn't seem to understand Nesta's reasons and Nesta's explanations, but it understands other characters' reasons and other characters' explanations. So really this comes down to how Nesta is framed versus how other characters are framed. As an example, Tamlin versus Rhysand. Tamlin and Rhysand do very similar things throughout the story of ACOTAR, but we only think one of these men ain't shit. But in reality, they both suck. And it's okay that they both suck. But the narrative works very hard to get us to forgive Rhysand for his bullshit, but then Tamlin, it's kind of like, no, like, fuck him. The narrative actually, the storytelling and the way that Sarah writes the story, it actually goes so far as to make Rhysand like the arbiter of morality in this world, which is not something that you should be doing for your morally gray book boyfriend. Like, what? Like, I don't need to sit here and come up with excuses or reasons for Rhysand's actions. The narrative does that for us. This is also why the pro-Tamlin people are so vocal. The narrative wants us to hate Tamlin and like Rhysand for what's essentially the same behavior. So the pro-Tamlin people, they're like, what the hell is this? For one, I think they're both the same. They're both foils. They're the same. Therefore, I think reasonably equally about them. I think Tamlin is a little, like, I'm writing Tamlin into the Daenerys fanfic that I'm writing because I think there's something to be said about the way that Tamlin is characterized versus the way that Rhysand is characterized for the exact same shit. This is also why nobody looks at Cassian twice for doing the bullshit that he does during A Court of Frost and Starlight and A Court of Silver Flames, because those books frame him as correct. And then they frame Nesta as wrong. Therefore, the pro Nesta girlies, they gotta go hard in the paint because they have to work against what the narrative is writing down about this character, even though logic and like reasoning and literary literacy tells us that Nesta is not as bad as the narrative makes her out to be. This is where I get yelled at. It's the difference between how Rachel Berry is characterized versus Santana Lopez being characterized in Glee for doing and saying reasonably similar things. Like, Rachel and Santana were both known for interrupting Glee rehearsal with their own bullshit. They were known for having a lot of ego, for distracting everybody with their relationship bullshit. But the difference between Santana and Rachel, and the reason why Rachel is the more controversial character within the Glee fandom versus Santana, who is universally beloved, is because Rachel is framed as wrong a lot of the time. I can't think of a single time during the run of Glee where Santana was not framed as correct. Even when she was bullying people, giving people mono to expose their cheating. Another example of like narrative framing in Glee in particular is Santana versus Quinn, where Quinn and Santana were both like HBICs. They were both bullies. They both had a lot of relationship drama. They were alpha bitches in their own way. But one, Quinn was framed as wrong a lot of the time. Santana was never framed as anything other than correct. But also, Santana's bullying and Santana's behavior was generally framed for comedy when she was being like a bitch. Quinn, when she was being a bitch, was always framed for drama. Therefore, Quinn got a lot more bullshit from the fandom than Santana ever did. This isn't to say that I don't love Santana or that Santana doesn't deserve the universal acclaim that she gets from the Glee fandom, because she absolutely does. But it just goes to show that narrative framing matters. And this is what we're seeing with Nesta. With Nesta, we're getting like the story of what she's doing, and the narrative is framing her as incorrect or as wrong or as bitchy. It's also framing her, like, her drinking as self-destructive, or her sleeping around as, like, inherently slutty and shitty. But then Morrigan gets to fuck around with Hellion, even though, like, she's miserable about it in the morning. And she gets to be the one who always has, like, a wine glass in her hand, and clearly has some issues that she's dealing with, but she is framed differently than Nesta. Therefore, we don't look at her behavior as closely as we do at Nesta's. Meanwhile, Morgan's drinking just as much as Nesta. She parties just as much. If anything, I remember the book saying, like, she lives at Rita's because that's, like, a place where she can be gay in peace. So it's not necessarily that Nesta girlies have excuses for Nesta and condemn everybody else. It's that the narrative is glossing over similar, if not the exact same behavior as what Nesta exhibits, but the narrative frames Nesta as wrong and frames, Morgan, Feyre, anybody else as correct, as right. Therefore, the Nesta girlies, we're seeing the writing on the wall here, and we're like, no, this is bullshit, and they're calling it out at every opportunity, and that's okay.